This week we are reviewing Die by Kieran Gillen and Stephanie Hans. In Die, we are encountering a story where it's kind of like a mixture between Jumanji and Stranger Things. A group of friends get together and play a role-playing game only to get sucked into it where bad things happen. So we'll start off by asking you guys, what did you guys think of this graphic novelist collection?
I thought it was a really interesting idea. I think they spent a lot of time creating a whole universe, and it was very painterly because of the art.
Definitely. I think when I thought going in, I said, oh, this would be a nice 5-issue story arc, and then by the end of it, I could see I was unfamiliar with the writer, but the way of storytelling, definitely, I said, oh, this could actually potentially go on for as long as he wants it to. So I think it's good when you can have a complete, concise story in almost 5 to 6 issues, but then you also leave yourself freedom of, well, if people like this, if this is good, let's keep going with it, yeah.
It definitely will appeal to people who are into role-playing games, has those fantasy elements, J.R.R. Tolkien, Gary Gygax, Dungeons and Dragons, all that stuff. They even make references to a couple other fantasy novels and movies throughout the series. But I think the key to all of this is really the characters. And while I've never role-played myself, and Miranda can probably speak better to this than me since I haven't, people have always told me that the key part of Dungeons and Dragons is the characters, like pushing the narrative. If the story is the pusher, then it becomes a little less compelling.
Exactly. You really need to take on that character and develop a personality for them, and that's the biggest part of role-playing. It's interacting with each other, being these different characters, utilizing all your skills and everything to navigate around the world and communicate with NPCs. And at first, when they get back into the world, they're kind of like, oh man. After a while, they get back into their roles, and especially we see the main character really becoming his character very quickly.
So just to go over quickly what the first issue is about. So it starts off with the main character, the narrator, Dominic. It's his 16th birthday. And his friend Solomon has created this world for him and his friends to play their role-playing game. Angela, who is Dominic's sister, was not supposed to come originally, but due to a traumatic event in her life, their family dog had just passed away. Dominic invites her along to kind of like ease the turmoil going on in her life. And we also meet his friends, Chuck, Matthew, Isabel, Sol, Solomon. So which one of those 6 characters did you guys most identify with?
I liked Angela the best. I thought she was a cool character. I really liked her class she took on, and she just was the most interesting to me, and I wanted to know more about her. So I'm hoping in the next issues we'll get to know more about her.
Yeah, she was definitely very quiet throughout and they even bring that up later in the series, that she's kind of very traumatized by what happens. Mm-hmm. We'll get to that in a few minutes, but
well, she had the most happen to her, but I'd say not in the initial introduction, but throughout the rest of the story and into especially once their roles became apparent in the game. I think Isabel to me was the most interesting because I think she has the most interesting, I think, abilities and everything, but also just when she's first introduced, she's very painted much in just a black and white, this is who she is, like boring, like whatever, like her and the narrator don't get along, Solomon's girlfriend, like she's kind of new, she's French, whatever, don't care. But then after, we jump ahead and get into the story, there's a lot more there than meets the eye, and I think it's just scratching the surface. I think, like she said, as it goes on, I think there's an ability for even more character growth there.
So the interesting thing to me was, first we have Dominic giving his opinion of each one of his friends. He talks about Angela, his sister, obviously, who's going through the traumatic event of their dog dying. Then he talks about Chuck, who he compares to like John Belushi from Animal House, but instead of doing coke, he's doing was it Sherbert, I believe?
Yeah.
Yeah. Matthew is the painfully smart, quiet one that, like, obviously smarter than the rest of them. You kind of get that idea. Mm-hmm. Then you have Isabel, like you said, who is French, adopted, aggressively bilingual is how he describes her, aggressively everything. And then Sol, who he doesn't really give a description for, he kind of leaves that one kind of open-ended. And then after you have that, like him introducing the characters, and you have Solomon, like, painting over top of them their characters. It seems like he tailors their characters to who they are. Of course, they come up with their own their attributes and everything. So he's giving out he gives out a different die to each one of them. So Dominic gets a D4 because he calls himself a dictator, a mixture of Cleopatra and Machiavelli. And we find out later on that his power is kind of like one of the stronger ones. Obviously, he's the narrator as well. And we find out what he can do is like make people do what he wants, right. Sort of. How did you guys feel about like how that played out throughout the series?
I think it definitely showed its usefulness towards the end, because when they were fighting the dragon, I was thinking, she's not going to be able to help at all here.
Yeah.
Right, and that's kind of, they mentioned that different times, the different characters, Matthew and Chuck, like, I really wish you'd pick up a weapon, and they keep saying, you know, I always have a weapon, like, I'm fine, like, don't worry about me, like, I'm good. And then they're like, yeah, but, like, you talk, like, I wish you had a sword, you know, like, we're fighting something, I wish you had a sword or something, and he's like, don't need it, like, I'm good. And as we've seen, he doesn't need it.
And even when his power is not there, he still have that power to sort of coerce people. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And then we move on to Matthew, who I thought was one of the more tragic characters in the series. His power is he turns emotions into power. So Solomon calls him the Grief Knight and hands him a D8. What do you guys think about how that played out throughout the series, his powers?
I think it's interesting because it seems like when they were first there, like he said, it was something that he could use very readily, but, you know, as it goes on and they come back, you know, many years later, he doesn't feel the same way he did when he was 16, so it's kind of like for him more than anybody, he's affected the most about trying to use his powers again, because he even says when he gets there, he's like, I'm happy now, like I don't, like, this isn't gonna work for me and everything. And so they kind of like, not necessarily play it for humor, but a little bit sometimes have to literally like kind of get your friend to cry and be sad about it in order for him to use his powers.
We also find out he may not be as happy as he says.
Right.
And how about you, Miranda? How did you feel about the...
I think definitely when you're a teenager, it's a lot easier to get emotional and have angst. And when you're older, you kind of have to put yourself together more for the world. So that was interesting. And we did see him being very resistant to letting his emotions show throughout the book. And there was a few times where Dominic was trying to make him sad, essentially, and he didn't want that to happen.
Yeah, it's kind of bad when your best friend or one of your best friends is there. Like, then they know your buttons to push because they know you so well. And he definitely knows the buttons to push with Matthew. And then we have Angela, who's the younger sister, and she has a one-track mind. Like, before she even gets in there, like, I want to play a cyberpunk. I want to play a cyberpunk. Mm-hmm. So, like you were saying, she's kind of quiet throughout the whole series. If you want to learn more about her, she's given a D10 and called Neo. How do you guys feel about her character during this?
I thought she was gonna have Keanu Reeves' abilities, but
that's kind of what I thought.
She didn't quite. But it was still very cool. She's also another character that has really cool abilities and everything, but I think like Miranda was saying, I think especially just being 5 issues and just where they go is so expansive and an entirely new world that we have to discover and explore. It's hard to get into hugely developed backstories for every single character. In this one, I feel like because of that, and because of, like we said, her trauma that she's possibly had the most out of everybody, maybe tied with Matthew, but definitely a lot. Her development and backstory kind of took a bit of a backseat, where we've been given details about what's happened to her, but we haven't really heard necessarily from her perspective.
And part of me wonders whether it's because Solomon didn't plan for her to be there, so he didn't have as much plan for her. But obviously that's not really covered in the...
Right.
That is an interesting way to think about it, though.
Yeah. How about you, Miranda? How do you feel about... Or did I ask... I'm sorry. Did I ask you already about Angela?
I guess we talked about her a little bit.
Yeah.
Just, I think she's a really interesting character, and the ability is kind of interesting. She needs to have a fairy dust. I can't remember exactly what
Fairy gold?
Yeah, fairy gold. And so it kind of makes her a little bit of a drug addict in a way, because she needs it to have her power. So she will definitely, I'm sure later in the book, be very desperate to get this. Otherwise, her power is completely useless. All of her equipment is dead every morning.
Exactly. Isabel, I think, to me, is like the coolest power. She's called the Godbinder, so she has gods as like pets. The only thing is, and she's also given a D12, the only thing is they don't always listen to her, or they have exchanges of favors for one another. Like, in order for me to do this, you have to do this for me, which definitely comes back to haunt her later.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And it's a really cool, like I said, a really cool ability, and that's why she's kind of one of my favorites. And they play off it where it's in her mind, I guess, when she was picking the character, she's like, you know, because she's an atheist, she's like, I'll just, you know, be in control of all these gods and I'll have them do my bidding. But like a lot of games, everything, how you think something's going to go isn't quite how it is. So like you said, like she can call on all these gods and everything, and for the most part they do listen to her, but it's usually in like, you owe me this, so you do this, or if you do this for me, I'll owe you something later, in which the gods usually take great pleasure in that, and they're like, oh, like, yes, you will owe me later, and like we'll see what that is
in the least opportune moment.
Right.
Exactly. And she's not really in as control as she wanted to be, for sure.
No, she thinks she's controlling the world, but it seems like it's controlling her instead.
Oh, definitely.
How did you feel about her character overall?
I thought she was interesting. What Chandler was saying earlier, too, we didn't learn too much about her just because the main character didn't really seem to be friendly with her. So I think we'll see a lot more of her come out. And it was very interesting later in the story when she is repaying one of her gods that she's basically a priest in front of a church, which is very ironic since she's an atheist.
Well, apparently their Bible is her diary also.
Yeah.
So that
seems like as much as she knows about the gods that she has to pay tribute for, they also know about her, and they use that to their advantage as well.
So it would be interesting, because they kind of cut off that scene in terms of what she was reading.
Mm-hmm.
Like you almost want, like, what was she going to read?
Fly on the wall. What's going on in there?
And then we are introduced to Chuck. Chuck is like the fun-loving guy of the group, it seems like. He doesn't take anything seriously, always joking around. Even in this game, he says, like, I just chose a couple cool abilities, whatever, we'll see what happens. I'm going to play this for fun. To which the DM was like, okay, well, you get a plain D6, whatever. You're just a joke to me at this point. How do you guys feel about him overall?
I think how a lot of people play D&D is kind of like that. They just kind of like want to have fun, and they don't really take their character too seriously. So I think he's like that's not like too into the story, just wants to be silly and have a good time.
So as I said, I've never role-played myself, but it seems like he may be like what they call like a hack and slash guy. Just go in, slash his sword a couple of times, kill a monster or two, go to the local tavern, pick up a girl.
Yep, exactly.
And that's what he considers like his role-playing experience.
I think if it was just strictly the board game, that might have been fine. But I think as the narrator says throughout the story, and also I think how everyone else kind of feels, is that one of his abilities, which is kind of cool, is that he has a lot of luck because he's the fool and because he does that. So it kind of protects him, but it only protects him.
Yeah.
So when he goes and does stuff like that, especially in this world where they have very serious consequences and they could all be very seriously injured, a lot of times because he's not thinking, he just rushes in and does stuff and can be a very big liability for the rest of the group.
Definitely the wild card.
I think he's the most interesting character of all of them in terms of. I do. I wish that he had been the narrator instead of the other ones, because I think he would have had a different take on it. Mm-hmm. I mean, I like Dominic, but I feel like sometimes he's very despondent. Like it's almost like he's too dour, whereas as Chuck seems to be enjoying the ride for everything. Mm-hmm. And we find out that he's kind of made money off of this also. He's written the fantasy book, I would assume, from the I forget what it was called. What was the book? Portals of.
I think he made a movie too, right?
Was it a movie
or a book?
I
think it's books, and it's been turned into a movie, and he's making another movie. So he's basically turned his experience into profit, which I don't think everyone else in the group is a huge fan of, he's done that.
He does. He does mention too that out of everybody in the group, he has essentially the best life. And
yet something happens later on that we question that also.
Exactly.
And then finally Saul he calls himself the master, and he gives himself the D20. And then they start the game. This is when they finally start the game, and the mom of Solomon comes down to check on them, and they're all gone. And they don't come back until 2 years later. And, 5 of them come back. They are missing Solomon. And when they come back, like we said, Angela is the one that has paid the biggest price from, at this point, she has lost her arm. And then we kind of take an intermission to jump to 25 years later, and see where all of them are after these traumas. It's Dominic's birthday. His friends aren't there. The only person that's hanging out with him is Angela. They go to the local bar, and there's a gift waiting for them. Obviously one that he wishes he did not get. He actually even says he doesn't want presents for his birthday. Mm-hmm. And the gift he gets is a bloody D20. His first instinct is to destroy it, which I think all of us would probably do after you've been sucked into a game for 2 years.
Right.
Instead of destroying it, he decides to call on his friends, have sort of a semi-reunion, under not exactly the best circumstances. And we find out where each one of them have been. What do you feel about where they are 25 years later, like each one of the characters?
I think it definitely shows more a bit of their, especially being the first issue, their personalities and who they kind of are and what the trauma of that has done and how they have moved past it. And whereas you see with Chuck, he's kind of been not ignoring it because he's profiting off of it, but to the sense of like not ignoring it, like I'm not gonna let it sink in and really overthink it. I'm just like, that was crazy, some stuff happened, whatever, but there was also some cool stuff. I'm just gonna live my life, whatever. And it seems that other people have tried, where Dominic, where he like can't get over it, and his life seems like he's been stuck there. Angela seems like kind of a lot of the same way. Like we said, she's maybe suffered the most in the game. At least she lost her arm. She's been through a lot of other trauma.
And Dominic's surprised with her because she's become like a game coder, and he's like, how can you do that?
That's
like,
really what you want to do after this. And then where Isabel is just, she's a school teacher, doesn't, have a family.
Same with Matthew. He has a family.
He does have a family. He's, I think, like you said, he's tried to flip his script where he, his mother had passed and he didn't have a lot of family. And then I think being through that, him trying to get over that was like, I don't want to live like this. I want to do it differently. Sort of the reverse of what Dominic did, of where of like, I don't want to be around people. He was kind of like, I need people. And I think for the most part that did help him in a bit, but all of that is for naught once they get back together.
It seems like all of them have gone their separate ways. Like they don't really talk to each other as much as they used to, except for Angela and Dominic. The rest of them seem to be more like, hey, let's not hang out because all it does is remind me of where we were. Of course, that may just be Dominic because Dominic talks about how he's been separated from the rest of them. So I don't know whether it's just him that's separated from the group. I get the sense like all of them have gone. That's
kind of when they got back together, it kind of seemed that way. That he said the only one he even really talked to was Matthew, and then he said, "How you been?" And he's like, "Oh crap, it's been 5 years. Yes. Like I'm a bad friend. Like I don't talk to any of these people." But we also find out there's maybe a reason for that because of something that happened in the game. They physically weren't able to talk about what happened.
Yeah, they call it the Gesh. It's like a spell that they put on themselves so they couldn't talk about it because they were worried that things were going to draw from reality and like cross the two dimensions. Yes.
Never cross the streams.
Exactly.
That's one thing we see a lot in the first issue is Dominic saying, I can't say.
And you assume it's like, well, obviously it must have been very traumatic, but it's like, you really can't talk about it. I can't physically say.
So then we have, it's like they're all introducing each other, talking to each other, like catching up, and then Angela's like, hey, let's get to what we're really here for.
It's enough of this nonsense.
So she seems like the most straightforward at this point, and so they pull out the die and they get sucked back into into the role playing game. We learn what Solomon has been up to.
Up to a lot.
So that's pretty much the end of issue 1. Now we're going to do this a little bit differently than previous videos. We're not going to go issue by issue. We wanted to more capture like the first issue in terms of the hooks and everything. But I do want to ask you guys, what are your 2 favorite scenes in the series?
One of my favorite parts was when they went to the inn, because I feel like that's a big part of any D&D or role-playing game is just hanging out with the NPCs and drinking and having a good time. Even though there's some things that are going on that not everyone's happy about, they still try and lighten up a little bit.
Well, they forced Matthew to tell his story.
And that's when things kind of take a turn.
Yes, you feel bad for him.
And I also really like Angela's talking about one last equipment of hers, and she really wants it, and she's not sure because she's not able to get the stuff she needs, it's going to die, and we find out that it's a dog named Case. So I think that was really important to her because the day they played the game, she lost her dog. So this is her fantasy version of her dog coming back.
Cyberpunk dog.
Yes.
One of my favorite moments, funny that you should say that, is actually when they're in the inn and they ask, because there's other, like she said, there's side characters there, and they're famous because they kind of know that I don't know that they know that they're like the humans Paragons from the world, but yeah, they call them the Paragons, and they're like, you're the heroes, and you're gonna save us from the the evil king, which is Saul, and so they're very interested in them, and so they ask Matthew, because he's the knight, what's your bravest story, what's your whatever, and that was actually one of my favorite moments, despite it being like really sad, because it really, for the first time in detail, captured, why he was, how he was when he was a kid, and what he's been up to since then. And it really, and from his perspective, so it really, and even, the art style change and everything for the backstory, and it really helped elaborate that character and really gave me reason to understand him and feel for that character. And I thought it was a really cool scene.
When they were playing with the Legos, he's like, don't take it apart, this is how it's supposed to be. And then it kind of gives an impetus, like, for a plan that they have.
Right. And I guess my second favorite part of the book might just be the ending, where, like I said, I kind of saw this all wrapping up at the end of this, and I was like, okay, like, this is a pretty good story. I think it might be wrapping up here, and then something happens, and then something happens again, and it goes a different way than I thought it was gonna go. Maybe not incredibly out of the blue something, but definitely not how I thought it was going to wrap up. And I realized, oh well, this could be a story that goes on for a very long time in a good way.
I'll give a light spoiler as to what you're talking about, and that is that the Fallen are different than what you think they are.
Yes.
And I think that adds definitely an interesting dimension to, like, what's happened before and what's going to happen in the future.
And definitely more stakes to where they are and what they're doing. Definitely. So that, I thought that was a very interesting thing that I didn't necessarily see coming, and like I said, definitely adds for a lot, longevity potentially of this, this story. So
one of my favorite scenes was the Angrian Knight, this backstory for, like, the relationship that Ash had. Dominic is called Ash in the is he called Ash?
Yeah.
He's called Ash all the time.
Okay.
I think it's the name he prefers.
Yes. It's kind of a relationship that he's had in the game. He plays a female character in the game, and you find, like, the backstory to that, like, and then it gets even deeper later on when they add, like, more layers to it. But the reason I like it is because it kind of shows what I was talking about at the beginning, and the characters are the focal point. These little side stories and everything, they're told in, like, 4 pages, 5 pages. They still have, like, a lot of emotional impact to them, but, like, it's more like this was something that just happened. It's more about the interaction between the characters and all of that. I don't know how you guys thought about that little side story.
I thought that was interesting.
Yeah. And then the other thing that I liked was when we have a special guest appearance by a fantasy writer, J.R.R. Tolkien, does a little stop by. I thought that was a cool cameo callback to, like, the influences of Dungeons and Dragons and all of that. Mm. So who would you guys think would like this book in terms of who might want to pick it up, give it a try?
I say anyone who's interested in fantasy or role-playing games, definitely, because this is kind of a what if I got sucked into the game type deal.
Mm-hmm. I definitely think pretty much anybody who's vaguely interested could read it. I think, like Miranda said, and you even alluded to, because I'm also not that familiar with that side of it. If you are more knowledgeable of stuff like D&D and games of that nature and that type of just overall knowledge of it, it might help a little bit more, where there were a few times where I was kind of a bit like, I guess this is how this goes during this game or whatever. I couldn't quite tell, okay, is this normal? I mean, obviously being sucked into the game isn't what normally, I assume, I don't know. But that's not what normally happens. But aside from that, like, stuff going on in characters, I'm like, are these normally characters for this? Is this just for this? So I had a little bit of confusion. Nothing in the overall arching story, but, like, specifics like that I wasn't as sure about. Whereas if you come from that background, it might be a lot more straightforward, and you can really just not have those questions, just focus strictly on the story.
Yeah, I would say anybody who likes fantasy stuff in general. But yes, Dungeons and Dragons players. If you like the movie Jumanji, again, I think that would definitely appeal to you. And I think that it definitely was a very good story overall. I know Miranda said, there's you said there is a role-playing game?
Yeah, actually in the back of the book, if you go to their website, they created a role-playing game based on this story, which I think is really cool, and I'm going to check it out later. It says they kind of have beta rules right now, but it sounds pretty cool, and I'm going to test it with my D&D group, and maybe we'll put something in the comments about how it was.
Sounds good. And also, this has been an option for a TV series, so I'm kind of torn on that, just because I hate when there's not enough material for them to really work with.
Right.
I'm afraid that they're kind of like I've never watched Game of Thrones or read the books, but I've heard, like, they veered definitely towards the end.
Yeah, they didn't have the source material.
Exactly. So I'm kind of concerned about that, I'm not going to lie.
Right.
But that's our review of Die. Hopefully you enjoyed it. And join us next week when we review another book. We don't know which one that is yet.